The crystal chandelier cast fractured rainbows across the polished marble floor of Belmont's grand ballroom as Maya Chen balanced 3 plates on her left arm, her right hand steadying a fourth. The annual Hartwell Foundation Gala was in full swing, and the air thrummed with the kind of laughter that only comes with champagne that costs more per bottle than most people earn in a week. Maya had been working events like this for 3 years now, invisible among the glittering crowd, a ghost in black polyester moving between tables laden with delicacies most of her neighbors could never afford to taste. She approached table 12 with practiced grace, her soft-soled shoes silent against the floor. The Ashford family occupied the prime seats. Harold Ashford, whose pharmaceutical empire had made headlines for both breakthrough medications and controversial pricing. His wife Vivian, whose charity work was as calculated as her Botox appointments. Their twin sons, Marcus and Blake, both fresh from their 3rd year at Harvard, and their daughter, Chloe, whose social media influence was built on a foundation of designer handbags and casual cruelty. "Excuse me," Maya said softly, approaching with their entrees, "the pan-seared duck with cherry reduction for—" "About time," Marcus interrupted, not looking up from his phone. "We've been waiting forever. What took you so long?" Maya felt the familiar tightness in her chest, but maintained her professional smile. "I apologize for any delay. The kitchen wanted to ensure everything was perfect for your table." Perfect? Look at her hands. Are those burns?" He pointed at the small scars that dotted Maya's knuckles and forearms, souvenirs from years of kitchen work. "I don't want someone with those kinds of hands touching my food." "Darling," Vivian said with mock concern, her diamond earrings catching the light as she turned to examine Maya, "you're absolutely right. Miss, have you been properly screened for communicable diseases? I mean, looking at you." She let her gaze travel pointedly over Maya's uniform, taking in the small stain near the pocket where she'd brushed against a sauce-covered pan earlier that evening. Maya's grip tightened imperceptibly. On her peripheral vision, she caught sight of Elena, her fellow server and closest friend at Morrison Catering, watching from across the room with concern. Elena had been there the night Maya had first broken down in the supply closet, overwhelmed by the combination of working 3 jobs and caring for her ailing grandmother. She'd also been there when Maya had received the letter, the one currently folded in her uniform pocket, worn soft from repeated handling. "I assure you, all of our staff follow strict health and safety protocols," Maya replied, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her cheeks. Harold leaned back in his chair, a man accustomed to being the center of attention. "You know, Vivian raises a good point. The help these days," he gestured vaguely at Maya as if she weren't standing right there, "standards have really declined. I remember when service staff took pride in their appearance." Chloe looked up from her phone long enough to snap a photo of Maya, her thumb already moving to add text. "This is going to be perfect content," she murmured. "The contrast between us and the workers, my followers eat this stuff up." Maya set the first plate down carefully, her movements precise despite the tremor she felt building in her hands. The duck's cherry reduction gleamed under the chandelier light, artfully arranged with microgreens that cost more than Maya's monthly bus pass. She had learned to disconnect during moments like this, to let her mind drift to other places while her body went through the motions of service. But tonight was different. Tonight, the letter in her pocket seemed to pulse with its own energy, a secret that had been burning inside her for weeks. Dr. Harrison Mitchell, the evening's keynote speaker, sat just 3 tables away, occasionally glancing in her direction with what might have been recognition. Maya had been carefully avoiding his gaze all evening, unsure whether he remembered her or if she was simply imagining the connection. "Actually," Marcus said, pulling out his phone to join his sister in photographing Maya, "this is hilarious. Look at this, Blake. She's trying so hard to look professional, but you can tell she's never been anywhere nice before. Probably thinks this is the fanciest place she'll ever see." The truth was, Maya had been in places far fancier than the Belmont Grand Ballroom. She had walked through the hollow halls of institutions these people could only dream of accessing. But that life felt like it belonged to someone else now, a ghost of a person she had been forced to leave behind when her grandmother's medical bills consumed everything. "Where did you go to school?" Blake asked with mock curiosity. "Let me guess, community college? Or did you even finish high school?" Maya placed the second plate down, her professional mask beginning to slip. "I attended—" "Oh, this should be good," Chloe interrupted, holding up her phone to record. "Tell us about your education, sweetheart. Our followers love inspirational stories about overcoming disadvantages." The word disadvantages hit Maya like a physical blow. She thought of her grandmother, Rosa Chen, lying in the specialized care facility across town, surrounded by machines that beeped out the rhythm of her failing heart. Rosa, who had sacrificed everything to raise Maya after her parents died in a car accident, who had worked 16-hour days at the textile factory to pay for Maya's tutoring, who had cried tears of joy when the acceptance letters started arriving from universities across the country. "Grandmother, you're going to be so proud," Maya had whispered into Rosa's ear just 3 months ago, when the world had still made sense. "Dr. Mitchell himself wants to discuss my research. Can you believe it? Your granddaughter, working with the Harrison Mitchell." But Rosa's stroke had changed everything overnight. The medical bills, the around-the-clock care, the experimental treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. Maya's academic future had crumbled under the weight of financial reality faster than she could have imagined possible. "I'm waiting," Blake said impatiently. "Don't tell me you're embarrassed about your background. We're all friends here." Maya looked around the table at their expectant faces, these people who had never known what it meant to choose between a textbook and a meal, who had never calculated whether they could afford both bus fare and lunch money, who had never sat in a hospital waiting room praying that insurance would cover a procedure that could save the life of someone they loved. "I studied at MIT, Maya said quietly. The laughter that erupted from the table was immediate and cruel. Marcus nearly choked on his champagne while Blake slapped the table in apparent delight. "MIT!" Vivian gasped between laughs. "Oh, darling, that's precious. I suppose you mean the community college with MIT in the name. There's always one of those in every town." "No," Maya said, her voice gaining strength. "Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I was pursuing my doctorate in biomedical engineering under Dr. Harrison Mitchell." The laughter faltered slightly, but Harold's expression remained condescending. "Listen, sweetheart, we appreciate imagination, but let's be realistic here. If you had gone to MIT, you wouldn't be serving us dinner." "Actually," Dr. Mitchell's voice cut through the conversation like a scalpel. The entire table turned to see the distinguished professor approaching, his keynote speech materials tucked under his arm. Harrison Mitchell was a legend in biomedical engineering, a man whose innovations had literally saved millions of lives. His word carried weight in circles these people desperately wanted to access. "Dr. Mitchell," Harold stammered, rising from his chair, "we didn't realize— surely you're mistaken." "I'm not mistaken," Dr. Mitchell said firmly. "Maya Chen was one of the most brilliant graduate students I ever had the privilege of mentoring. Her research on biocompatible neural interfaces was revolutionary, work that could change the lives of millions of people with neurological conditions." The silence at the table was deafening. Maya felt tears building behind her eyes, not from shame, but from the unexpected validation. She had been invisible for so long, her identity reduced to the uniform she wore and the plates she carried. "Then why is she—" Chloe's voice trailed off, her phone still recording. "Because sometimes life forces us to make impossible choices," Dr. Mitchell said, his gaze moving to Maya with understanding. "But brilliance doesn't disappear just because circumstances change." Maya reached into her pocket and pulled out the letter she had been carrying for weeks, the one from the National Institute of Health, offering her a full research fellowship with a stipend large enough to cover Rose's care and her own expenses. The letter she had been afraid to believe was real, afraid to hope for a way back to the life she had lost. "I received this 3 weeks ago," Maya said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Dr. Mitchell nominated me for a fellowship that will allow me to complete my research while providing for my grandmother's medical care." The Ashford family sat in stunned silence as Maya unfolded the letter, the NIH letterhead gleaming in the chandelier light. Around them, other tables had begun to take notice of the commotion, and Maya realized that the microphone from Dr. Mitchell's presentation setup was nearby, connected to the ballroom's sound system. Elena caught Maya's eye from across the room and nodded encouragingly. Other servers had gathered at a respectful distance, their own stories of struggle and perseverance written in the lines of their faces. Maya thought of all the times she had been dismissed, overlooked, treated as less than human simply because of the job she was forced to take. The microphone beckoned.
Maya's day had started at 5:47 a.m., just as it had every morning for the past 18 months. The alarm on her phone, a cracked iPhone 6 that she'd been nursing along with a case held together by electrical tape, buzzed against the scarred wooden nightstand in her studio apartment. The sound cut through the thin walls and the distant hum of traffic on Interstate 95, where trucks had been rumbling past since before dawn. She rolled out of bed with practiced efficiency, her feet finding the cold hardwood floor. The apartment was a study in careful economics, $800 a month for 400 square feet, in a neighborhood where the sound of sirens was as common as birdsong. But it was clean, and it was hers, and most importantly, it was affordable enough to leave room in her budget for Rosa's care. The bathroom mirror reflected a face that had aged years in the span of months. Maya's dark eyes, once bright with academic ambition, now carried the weight of constant exhaustion. Her black hair, which she'd once worn long and loose during her graduate school days, was now pulled back in a practical bun that could survive a 12-hour shift in a commercial kitchen. Her hands, the same hands Blake Ashford would later mock, bore the small scars and calluses that came from working with hot pans, sharp knives, and industrial cleaning chemicals. The morning routine was mechanical. Shower in 4 minutes to save on the hot water bill. Dress in the first of 3 uniforms she'd have to wear throughout the day. Grab the breakfast she'd prepared the night before. Instant oatmeal mixed with protein powder and frozen berries. A meal that cost less than $2 but provided enough fuel to get through her first job. At 6:30 a.m. sharp, Maya stepped onto the bus that would take her to Sunrise Senior Care, where she worked as a certified nursing assistant 3 days a week. The other passengers were fellow travelers in the economy of early morning. Housekeepers heading to clean office buildings, fast food workers preparing for the breakfast rush, and security guards ending their overnight shifts. They all shared the particular exhaustion of people who worked multiple jobs to make ends meet. Rosa's room was on the 3rd floor, facing east so that the morning sunlight would stream through the windows. Maya had specifically requested this room, paying extra for the view because she knew her grandmother loved to watch the sunrise. Rosa Chen had been a woman of ritual and beauty, someone who found meaning in small daily ceremonies. Even now, in her diminished state, her eyes would track the light as it moved across the walls. "Good morning, Nai," Maya whispered, using the Mandarin term for grandmother that had been her first word as a child. "I brought your favorite tea." Rosa's eyes flickered with recognition, though the stroke had stolen most of her words. Maya had learned to read the subtle communications in her grandmother's expressions, the slight tightening around the eyes that meant pain, the soft exhalation that indicated pleasure, the way her fingers would move against the blanket when she wanted Maya to come closer. The tea was jasmine green tea, imported from the same province in China where Rosa had been born 87 years ago. It cost more than Maya could afford, but she bought it anyway, steeping it carefully in the small electric kettle she'd smuggled into the facility. The nurses looked the other way because they understood that these small acts of love were sometimes all that remained. "I have news, Nai," Maya said softly, pulling the NIH letter from her pocket. She had been carrying it everywhere, afraid to leave it at home where it might somehow disappear, afraid that it was too good to be true. "Dr. Mitchell wrote to the National Institute of Health about my research. They want to fund my work." Rosa's eyes sharpened with interest. Even in her compromised state, she understood that this was important. Maya had been reading to her from scientific journals for months, explaining her research into neural interfaces that could help stroke victims regain communication abilities. It was work that had taken on personal urgency since Rosa's illness, a mission that kept Maya connected to her academic identity, even as she scrubbed floors and served drinks to people who saw her as invisible. "The fellowship would pay enough for me to finish my doctorate and cover your care. I could go back to the lab. I could finish what we started." Rosa's hand moved slightly on the blanket, and Maya reached out to clasp it. Her grandmother's skin was paper-thin now, marked with age spots and the purple bruises that came from blood thinners, but Maya could still feel the strength in those fingers, the same hands that had worked 16-hour shifts at the textile factory, that had braided Maya's hair before school each morning, that had held her when the nightmares came after her parents died. At 8 a.m., Maya's shift at the nursing facility ended, and she caught another bus to her second job at Morrison Catering. The commercial kitchen was a different world entirely, all stainless steel surfaces and industrial equipment, where she spent her mornings prepping vegetables, washing dishes, and learning the rhythms of large-scale food service. The work was hot and demanding, but Maya had grown to appreciate its physicality. After years of living in her mind, working complex problems with equations and theoretical models, there was something grounding about the simple reality of knife work and clean surfaces. Elena Vasquez had been working at Morrison's for 7 years, and she'd taken Maya under her wing from the first day. Elena was raising 3 children on her own after her husband's deportation, and she understood the arithmetic of survival, how many double shifts it took to pay rent, which bills could be delayed without penalty, and where to find the best deals on school clothes and groceries. "You're different from the others," Elena had told Maya during her first week. "You talk like someone who's been to college."
Maya had been evasive then, not ready to share her story. But over months of working side by side, chopping vegetables and discussing their children, Elena's 3 biological children and Maya's grandmother, who required similar attention and care, the truth had gradually emerged. "My friend, you need to tell people who you are," Elena would say during their brief breaks. "You have knowledge. You shouldn't hide it." But Maya had learned that her education could be a liability in this world. Other workers sometimes resented what they saw as her advantages, assuming she was slumming temporarily before returning to her privileged life. They didn't understand that Rosa's medical bills had consumed her savings and forced her to drop out of school. They didn't know about the nights she lay awake, calculating whether she could afford both her grandmother's medications and her own bus fare to work. The afternoon shift at Morrison's was dedicated to event preparation. Maya had become skilled at the choreography of catering, how to pack transportation boxes so that delicate garnishes arrived intact, how to set up serving stations for maximum efficiency, how to move through crowds of guests without disrupting conversations or drawing attention to herself. But the evening events were the hardest part of her week. Serving at galas and corporate functions meant entering worlds she had once belonged to, spaces where she had to smile politely while being treated as furniture by people who had never known struggle. She had served dinner to her former classmates without them recognizing her, had been lectured about work ethic by people whose trust funds exceeded her lifetime earnings, had been photographed by social media influencers who turned service workers into content for their followers' entertainment. Each slight, each dismissive comment, each moment of casual cruelty was a small cut that Maya absorbed and carried with her. She had trained herself not to react, to maintain the professional demeanor that her job required. But the cost was mounting. She could feel pieces of herself disappearing, her sense of worth eroding under the constant message that her value as a person was tied to her ability to serve others without complaint. The irony was that her current research, the work that had caught Dr. Mitchell's attention, had grown directly out of her grandmother's condition. The neural interface technology Maya was developing could potentially help stroke victims communicate, could restore agency to people whose voices had been silenced by medical trauma. It was work that mattered desperately to her, but it existed in a parallel universe from her daily life of service and survival. At night, after her shifts ended and she'd visited Rosa one more time, Maya would return to her small apartment and try to keep her research alive. She'd set up a makeshift laboratory on her kitchen table, using borrowed equipment and supplies she couldn't afford. Her laptop, held together with duct tape and determination, connected her to databases and research communities where she could still contribute to scientific discussions under her real name. The academic Maya Chen still existed in these late-night hours. She published papers when she could afford the submission fees, attended virtual conferences when her work schedule allowed, and maintained correspondence with researchers around the world who knew her only through her publications. Dr. Mitchell had been one of these collaborators, someone who had continued to believe in her potential even after she'd been forced to leave MIT. But maintaining dual identities was exhausting. During the day, she was invisible, a server, a cleaner, a person whose opinions and insights were unwelcome. At night, she was Dr. Maya Chen, a researcher whose work on biocompatible neural interfaces could potentially help stroke victims communicate, could restore agency to people whose voices had been silenced by medical trauma. It was work that mattered desperately to her, but it existed in a parallel universe from her daily life of service and survival. The letter from the National Institute of Health arrived on a particularly difficult day. Rosa had taken a turn for the worse, requiring additional care that strained Maya's already tight budget. The stress had triggered one of Maya's panic attacks, a new development since her grandmother's stroke, and she'd found herself hyperventilating in the supply closet at Morrison's, surrounded by industrial-sized cans of tomatoes and the smell of commercial cleaning supplies. Elena had found her there, had helped her breathe through the attack, and listened as Maya finally broke down and told her everything about MIT, about her research, about the impossible choice between her academic future and her grandmother's life. You think you have to choose, but maybe there's another way. Maybe your story isn't over, Elena had said. The letter had felt like an answer to prayers Maya hadn't known she was praying. The NIH fellowship would provide enough funding for her to complete her doctorate while maintaining Rosa's care. But more than the money, it represented validation, proof that her scientific identity hadn't been erased by circumstances, that her value as a person was extended beyond her ability to serve others without complaint. Yet Maya had been afraid to hope. Too many things had gone wrong. Too many doors had closed. She carried the letter everywhere, reading it obsessively, searching for hidden conditions or fine print that would make it impossible. She had been hurt too many times by promises that evaporated when reality intruded. The morning of the Hartwell Foundation Gala, Maya had made a decision. She would use the event as a test. If she could make it through another evening of casual humiliation without losing herself completely, then maybe she was strong enough to step back into the academic world. Maybe she could reclaim the identity she had been forced to abandon. She had not anticipated that the test would come in the form of the Ashford family, or that Dr. Mitchell would be there to witness her humiliation. She had not expected that her two worlds would collide so dramatically, or that the moment of collision would occur with a microphone nearby and an audience watching. But as she stood in the ballroom, feeling the weight of the letter in her pocket and the eyes of the crowd upon her, Maya realized that she had been preparing for this moment throughout all the months of survival. Every plate she had carried, every insult she had absorbed, every night she had spent maintaining her research while the world slept, it had all been building toward this moment of choice. The microphone waited, offering her a chance to speak her truth to people who had spent the evening treating her as invisible. Maya thought of Rosa, lying in her hospital bed with eyes that still sparkled with intelligence despite the stroke's damage. She thought of Elena and the other workers who had their own stories of struggle and perseverance. She thought of all the voices that had been silenced by circumstance, by prejudice, by the casual assumption that a person's worth could be measured by their current job title. Her hand moved toward the microphone. The first time someone had treated Maya as invisible because of her uniform, it had been a shock. Dr. Patricia Westbrook, the head of MIT's Biomedical Engineering Department, had walked right past her in the hospital cafeteria where Maya was picking up lunch for Rosa during visiting hours. Maya had been wearing scrubs from her part-time job as a research assistant in the Neurological Rehabilitation Unit, and Dr. Westbrook, who had praised Maya's groundbreaking research just days before, looked right through her as if she were part of the furniture. That was 6 months after Rosa's stroke, when Maya was still trying to balance her doctoral studies with her grandmother's care needs. She had approached Dr. Westbrook, intending to discuss the revision timeline for her dissertation, but the professor's eyes had slid over her without recognition before turning to greet a pharmaceutical executive Maya recognized from industry conferences. "Dr. Westbrook," Maya had said, stepping closer.
I wanted to follow up on our discussion about the neuroplasticity measurements in my latest trials. The professor had turned with the polite but distant expression reserved for service workers. I think you have me confused with someone else. I don't have any discussions with... She had gestured vaguely at Maya Scrubs. It's Maya Chen, your doctoral student. We met yesterday in your office about my research on biocompatible interfaces for stroke recovery. The recognition that had finally dawned in Dr. Westbrook's eyes had been almost worse than the initial dismissal. Maya, my God, I didn't... Why are you dressed like that? The humiliation of having to explain her circumstances to someone who had once called her work revolutionary had been devastating. But it was only the beginning. The incidents had accumulated like small cuts, each one seemingly minor but collectively draining. There was the department secretary who had refused to let her into the building without ID, despite having buzzed her in hundreds of times before. Security policy, she had explained, though she had waved through 2 male students who weren't even from our department. There was the research symposium where Maya had been asked to clear tables during the break, with colleagues assuming she was catering staff, rather than one of the presenting researchers. The worst had been Dr. Richard Steinberg, a rival researcher who had been competing with Maya for grant funding before her circumstances changed. She had encountered him at Mass General Hospital while visiting Rosa, and he had made a show of pressing her $20 bill into her hand. For your hard work. It's always nice to see former students finding alternative career paths. The implication was clear. Maya had failed academically and been reduced to menial labor. Dr. Steinberg had no way of knowing that she was maintaining her research despite impossible circumstances, that her work was actually accelerating because of her personal connection to stroke recovery. He saw only the uniform and made assumptions about her worth based on her appearance. But the cruelest moments had come from her former peers, other doctoral students who had once collaborated with her, who had borrowed her equipment and sought her advice on complex problems. Running into David Park at a coffee shop near the university had been particularly painful. David had been her lab partner for 2 years, someone she had considered a friend as well as a colleague. Maya, he had called out, then stopped short when he saw her Morrison catering uniform. Oh, I heard you'd left the program?
Right, David had interrupted, his tone shifting to the careful politeness people used with service workers. Well, good luck with everything. He'd glanced at her uniform again. I should get going. Meeting with Dr. Mitchell about my defense proposal. The casual mention of Dr. Mitchell had stung particularly hard. Maya's former mentor had been understanding about her need to suspend her studies, but she knew that academic momentum was everything in their field. Every month away from the lab made her research less relevant, her position less secure. David and others were advancing while she was serving drinks and wiping tables. Maya had wanted to tell him about her late-night research sessions, about the breakthrough she'd achieved in biocompatible coating materials, about the papers she was still publishing despite her circumstances. But she'd recognized the look in his eyes, the same combination of pity and relief that she'd seen in others. Pity for her circumstances, relief that it hadn't happened to them. The Morrison catering job had brought new categories of humiliation. Corporate events were particularly brutal because they attracted people from academic and research circles who might have known her professionally. Maya had served dinner to 3 professors from Harvard Medical School who had cited her research in their own papers, none of whom recognized her behind the serving tray. But it was the casual cruelty of clients that wore her down most systematically. The Winterbourne wedding reception had been an early lesson in how wealth could distort people's basic humanity. Margaret Winterbourne, the mother of the bride, had sent back Maya's first attempt at serving her salad because the girl's hands looked dirty. Maya's hands had been spotless, but the small scars from kitchen work had been enough to trigger the complaint. "Can we get someone else?"
Margaret had asked the event coordinator loudly. Someone more presentable? Maya had been reassigned to kitchen duty for the rest of the evening, watching through the service window as other servers, all white, all without visible scars, attended to the guests. Elena had found her crying in the walk-in freezer during her break. "They see what they expect to see," Elena had said, wrapping her in a towel from the warming station. "But that doesn't make it true." The Pemberton Foundation fundraiser had brought different humiliations. Senator James Pemberton himself had cornered Maya near the coat check, his breath heavy with whiskey and entitlement. "You look familiar," he'd said, standing too close. "Have we met before?" Maya had recognized him immediately. He'd been a guest speaker at MIT, someone whose policy decisions affected research funding across the country. She'd even asked him a question during the Q&A session about federal support for biomedical engineering programs. "I don't believe so, sir," she'd replied carefully. "I never forget a pretty face," he continued, his hand moving to touch her arm. "Maybe we could continue this conversation somewhere more private." Maya had extracted herself politely but firmly, only to have Senator Pemberton complain to the event coordinator about her attitude problem. She'd been written up for unprofessional behavior with a client, a mark on her employment record that could have cost her the job she desperately needed. The technology conference at the Hyatt had been particularly surreal. Maya had been serving lunch to a panel discussion on innovations in neural interface technology, her own field of expertise. Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, from Stanford, had been presenting research that built directly on Maya's published work, though she'd cited it incorrectly and missed several key implications. Maya had wanted desperately to raise her hand to point out the error that could impact the entire research trajectory. But she was invisible behind the serving cart, just another uniformed worker cleaning up coffee cups and replacing water glasses. She'd watched in frustration as the discussion went off course, as brilliant researchers pursued dead ends that her work had already eliminated. During the break, she'd approached Dr. Chen carefully. "Excuse me, I couldn't help but notice your presentation mentioned biocompatible coatings for neural interfaces." Dr. Chen had looked at her with barely concealed irritation. "Yes? Think there might be an error in the molecular binding calculations you referenced from the Chen et al. Paper? The actual binding coefficient—" "I'm sorry," Dr. Chen had interrupted, "but I don't discuss research with catering staff. If you have concerns about the presentation, you can contact my assistant." The dismissal had been devastating. Maya's own research, misinterpreted and misdirected while she stood powerless to correct the record because her uniform marked her unworthy of scientific discussion. But the most systematic cruelty had come from repeat clients, people who saw Maya regularly at different events and seemed to take pleasure in treating her as a recurring character in their entertainment. Maya had served them at 3 previous events over the past year. Each time, they'd seemed to recognize her as someone they could safely mock without consequences. At the hospital fundraiser in March, Vivian Hartwell had made a show of inspecting Maya's fingernails before allowing her to serve the bread course. "I just think cleanliness is so important," Vivian had announced to her table mates. "You can tell so much about people from their hands." At the museum benefit in June, Marcus Hartwell had photographed Maya struggling with a heavy tray, posting the image to his social media with the caption, "The real MVP's working hard tonight." The post had gone viral, with thousands of comments about Maya's inspiring work ethic and humble service, none of which acknowledged her as a full human being with thoughts and feelings and dreams beyond their entertainment. In September, at the Literacy Foundation event, Blake Hartwell had engaged Maya in conversation specifically to mock her responses.
"So what's your 5-year plan?" he'd asked with fake sincerity. "Still planning to be carrying plates, or do you have bigger ambitions?" Maya had tried to deflect politely, but Blake had pressed harder. "Come on, don't be shy. I bet you have dreams. Let me guess, manager at a restaurant, maybe even owner someday?" The assumption that her current circumstances represented the height of her aspirations had been particularly painful because Maya was simultaneously working on research that could change the lives of millions of people with neurological conditions. But she learned that defending herself only invited more mockery, that any response would be twisted into content for their amusement. Each event had built on the previous humiliations, with the Hartwell family treating Maya as a familiar target for their casual cruelty. They developed inside jokes at her expense, references to previous encounters that established their dominance and her subservience. Maya had become a character in their narrative of superiority, proof of their elevated status in the social hierarchy. Other clients had followed similar patterns. The Morrison family, no relation to her employer, had made it a sport of finding fault with Maya's service, sending back drinks that were perfectly prepared and complaining about imaginary delays. The Blackstone Industries executives had treated Maya as a prop for their business entertainment, making jokes about the help while she served their expensive whiskey. But perhaps the most insidious form of mistreatment had been the photography. Maya had lost count of how many times she'd been photographed or filmed by guests who wanted to document their charitable events or luxurious experiences. She'd appeared in countless social media posts as background scenery, her identity reduced to a visual element that proved the photographer's elevated status. Chloe Hartwell had been particularly aggressive about this, treating Maya as a recurring character for her lifestyle content. She'd filmed Maya serving drinks with commentary about appreciating the little people and staying humble. Maya had become unwilling content for an audience that saw her not as a person, but as a symbol of service and struggle. The accumulation of these incidents had taken a psychological toll that Maya hadn't fully recognized until Dr. Mitchell's letter arrived. She'd been so focused on survival, earning enough money to cover Rosa's care, maintaining her research in stolen moments, preserving her academic connections despite her circumstances, that she'd suppressed her emotional responses to the constant degradation. But the letter had awakened something in her, a reminder of who she had been and could be again. It had given her permission to feel angry about the treatment she had endured, to recognize that the humiliation wasn't something she deserved, but something that revealed the character flaws of the people inflicting it. Now standing in the Belmont Grand Ballroom with the microphone within reach, Maya felt 18 months of accumulated injustice crystallizing into a moment of choice. She could continue to accept invisibility and mockery as the price of survival, or she could reclaim her voice and speak truth to people who had never been forced to see her as a fully human being. The Ashford family sat before her in stunned silence, their earlier laughter replaced by uncertainty as they processed the revelation of her true identity. Dr. Mitchell's validation had cracked their facade of superiority, but Maya knew that without her own response, the moment would pass and nothing would fundamentally change. Around the ballroom, other servers paused in their work to watch the confrontation unfold. Elena caught Maya's eye from across the room and nodded encouragingly. These were her colleagues, her fellow travelers in the economy of service work, people whose stories of struggle and resilience deserved to be heard. Maya's hand closed around the microphone. Maya's fingers wrapped around the microphone with the same precision she'd once used to calibrate neural sensors in Dr. Mitchell's laboratory. The device was surprisingly light in her hand, a simple tool that could amplify her voice across the entire ballroom, reaching every guest who had spent the evening viewing her as invisible. The feedback screech that emerged when she first lifted the microphone to her lips cut through the orchestral background music like a knife. Conversations halted mid-sentence as heads turned toward the disturbance. The ballroom's lighting system automatically adjusted, focusing additional illumination on her position as if the universe itself was conspiring to make this moment inevitable.
"Ladies and gentlemen," Maya began, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system despite the tremor she felt in her chest. "I apologize for the interruption, but I believe there's been a fundamental misunderstanding this evening." The Ashford family sat frozen at their table, their faces cycling through expressions of confusion, embarrassment, and dawning horror as they realized their evening's entertainment had just hijacked the microphone. Harold's hand moved instinctively toward his phone, perhaps to call security, but Dr. Mitchell stepped closer to Maya's position in a gesture of unmistakable support. "My name is Maya Chen," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "For the past 18 months, I've had the privilege of serving many of you at events like this one. I've brought you drinks, cleared your plates, and cleaned up after your celebrations. And in all that time, I've learned something fascinating about human nature." A murmur rippled through the crowd as more guests turned their attention to the unexpected speaker. Maya could see Elena moving closer through the kitchen doors, along with other Morrison catering staff who had paused in their duties to witness this unprecedented moment. Their faces showed a mixture of pride and concern, pride for Maya's courage, and concern for the potential consequences. "I've learned that many of you believe a person's worth can be measured by their uniform," Maya said, gesturing to her black polyester server's outfit. "You see these clothes, these hands that show the marks of honest work, and you make assumptions about my intelligence, my education, my value as a human being." Margaret Pemberton, whom Maya had served at 2 previous events, was whispering urgently to her husband. Maya could see her phone already out, likely recording the scene for social media. The irony wasn't lost on Maya that she was about to become content once again, but this time on her own terms. "The gentleman at table 12 asked about my education," Maya continued, her gaze moving to Blake Ashford, whose face had gone pale. "He seemed to find it amusing when I mentioned MIT. So let me provide some context for that education you found so impossible to believe." Dr. Mitchell moved to stand directly behind Maya, his presence lending authority to her words. She noticed other faculty members and researchers in the audience beginning to recognize her, people from conferences and symposiums who had known her in her previous life but had looked right through her in her server's uniform. "I entered MIT at age 16 with a full academic scholarship. I completed my undergraduate degree in biomedical engineering in 3 years, graduating summa cum laude with a thesis on neural pathway reconstruction that was published in the Journal of Biomedical Engineering." The murmur in the crowd grew louder. Maya could see phones appearing at tables throughout the ballroom as guests began recording her impromptu presentation. Chloe Ashford was frantically typing on her device, probably trying to delete previous posts that had mocked Maya's intelligence. "I was accepted into MIT's doctoral program under the mentorship of Dr. Harrison Mitchell," Maya continued, nodding toward her former advisor. "My research focused on biocompatible neural interfaces for stroke recovery, work that has direct relevance to the millions of families affected by cerebral vascular accidents." Dr. Sarah Chen from Stanford, who was seated at a table near the front, had gone rigid with recognition. Maya could see the moment when she realized this was the same person she'd dismissed at the technology conference, the catering staff member who had tried to correct her research presentation. "My dissertation work involved developing new materials for neural implants that could integrate with damaged brain tissue to restore communication pathways. It's research that became deeply personal when my grandmother, Rosa Chen, suffered a massive stroke that left her unable to speak." The revelation of personal motivation seemed to shift something in the room's energy. Maya could see expressions changing from curiosity to sympathy as guests began to understand the context of her circumstances. "Rosa Chen raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 8 years old.
She worked 16-hour shifts at a textile factory to pay for my education. She never graduated from high school herself, but she understood that knowledge was the one thing no one could take away from me. Eleanor Hartwell, who had been silent throughout the evening's earlier confrontation, was now crying openly. Maya could see similar emotional responses throughout the audience as her story connected with people who had their own experiences with family sacrifice and love. When Rosa had her stroke, the medical bills were immediate and overwhelming. The experimental treatments that might help her weren't covered by insurance. The specialized care facility where she could receive the attention she needed cost more than my graduate stipend could cover. The ballroom had grown completely silent except for Maya's voice. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their work to listen through the service windows. This was more than just one person's story.
Indictment of a system that forced people to choose between education and family, between personal advancement and caring for those they loved. So I made a choice, Maya said simply. I suspended my doctoral studies and took whatever work I could find that would pay enough to cover Rosa's care. Morrison Catering hired me despite my lack of experience in food service. They saw someone who was willing to work hard and learn quickly. James Morrison himself was present at the event, seated at a table with other local business leaders. Maya could see him straightening with pride as she mentioned his company. He had always treated his employees with respect, but Maya knew he hadn't fully understood the academic credentials she'd brought to her server position. For 18 months, I've worked multiple jobs to pay for Rosa's care while continuing my research in whatever time I could find, Maya continued. I've published 3 peer-reviewed papers during this period, maintained my laboratory connections, and developed new innovations in neural interface technology. Dr. Patricia Westbrook, who had failed to recognize Maya in the hospital cafeteria, was shaking her head in apparent disbelief. Maya could see the recognition dawning on her face, the understanding of how badly she had misjudged the situation during their awkward encounter. But here's what I've learned that wasn't covered in any of my graduate courses, Maya said, her voice taking on an edge of steel. I've learned that many people believe your current job title defines your worth as a human being. I've learned that visible scars from honest work are seen as marks of shame rather than badges of honor. Senator Pemberton, who had propositioned Maya at the foundation fundraiser, was conspicuously examining his water glass, clearly hoping to avoid being recognized as one of the people who had mistreated her. I've learned that some people treat service workers as entertainment, as props for their social media content, as confirmation of their own elevated status in society, Maya continued, her gaze moving deliberately to Chloe Ashford. I've been photographed, mocked, and dismissed by people who have never known what it means to sacrifice their dreams for someone they love. The silence in the ballroom was profound now, broken only by the soft sound of someone crying. I realized it was Elena, her colleague and friend, who was watching from the kitchen doorway with tears streaming down her face. 3 weeks ago, I received a letter that changed everything, Maya said, pulling the NIH document from her pocket and holding it up so the entire room could see the official letterhead. The National Institute of Health has awarded me a full research fellowship based on my work in neural interface technology. The fellowship provides enough funding for me to complete my doctorate while maintaining my grandmother's care. The applause that erupted was spontaneous and thunderous. Maya was startled by its intensity. She hadn't expected the crowd to respond with such enthusiasm. But as she looked around the ballroom, she could see that her story had resonated far beyond her specific circumstances. Dr. Mitchell stepped forward and took the microphone gently from Maya's hands. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to understand what you've just heard. Maya Chen's research on biocompatible neural interfaces represents a potential breakthrough in treating stroke victims, traumatic brain injury patients, and individuals with degenerative neurological conditions. He paused to let that information sink in before continuing. Her work could literally restore communication to millions of people who have lost their ability to speak. And she's been developing this life-saving technology while working multiple jobs to care for her grandmother and enduring treatment that no human being should have to accept. More applause followed, but Maya could see that the response wasn't universal. Some guests, particularly those who had been most cruel in their treatment of service workers, looked uncomfortable and defensive. The Ashford family appeared to be having a heated, whispered conversation among themselves. "I want to address something directly," Dr. Mitchell continued, his voice taking on the authority of someone accustomed to commanding respect. "Maya's circumstances forced her into service work, but there is nothing shameful about any honest job. The shame lies with those of us who failed to see the full humanity of the people who serve us." Senator Pemberton was now actively trying to leave the ballroom, but his exit was blocked by the crowd of people who had gathered around Maya's position. Several other guests who had mistreated service workers at various events were similarly attempting discreet departures. Maya has shown us that brilliance doesn't disappear when circumstances change. But more importantly, she's shown us that every person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect regardless of their current occupation or economic situation. Dr. Sarah Chen approached the microphone area, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Dr. Mitchell, if I could have a word with Miss Chen." "Dr. Chen," Maya corrected quietly, "I haven't lost my academic credentials just because I've been serving dinner." The correction was gentle but firm, and it prompted another wave of applause from the crowd. Maya could see understanding spreading through the ballroom as guests began to reconsider their own interactions with service workers. "Dr. Chen," Sarah corrected herself, "I owe you a profound apology. At the technology conference, I should have listened to your input on my presentation. Your correction of my binding coefficient calculations was accurate, and my dismissal of your expertise was inexcusable."
The public apology seemed to open a floodgate. Dr. Westbrook approached with tears in her eyes, followed by several other faculty members who had failed to recognize Maya in various circumstances. The scene was becoming a spontaneous reconciliation, with people stepping forward to acknowledge their own failures of recognition and respect. But not everyone was participating in the moment of collective conscience. Harold Ashford stood abruptly from his table, his face red with anger or embarrassment. "This is ridiculous," he announced loudly. "We came here for a charity dinner, not a sob story from the help." The comment cut through the goodwill like a blade, and Maya felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with public humiliation. But before she could respond, something unexpected happened. Elena stepped forward from the kitchen area, her Morrison catering uniform spotless despite the evening's work. "Sir," Elena said with quiet dignity, "Dr. Chen is my friend and colleague. She has never asked anyone for pity or special treatment. She has simply asked to be treated with basic human respect." Other service workers began to emerge from their positions around the ballroom, forming a loose circle of support around Maya. They represented restaurants, catering companies, hotels, and cleaning services throughout the city, people whose labor made events like this possible, but who were rarely acknowledged as full human beings. "We all have stories," Elena continued, her accented English carrying clearly through the ballroom's acoustics. "We all have dreams and struggles and families we love. Dr. Chen has shown us that our circumstances don't define our worth." Maya felt overwhelmed by the unexpected solidarity. She had anticipated that speaking out might cost her her job, that standing up for herself would result in punishment rather than support. But the response from her colleagues suggested that her courage had given them permission to reclaim their own dignity. Vivian Ashford seemed to realize that the evening had turned decisively against her family. "Harold," she whispered urgently, "we should leave. This is becoming a spectacle." But their exit was complicated by the crowd of people now surrounding Maya, all wanting to apologize, to offer support, or to share their own stories of misjudgment and recognition. The ballroom had transformed from a formal charity dinner into an impromptu forum on dignity, respect, and the value of human connection across economic divides. Maya looked around at the faces surrounding her, researchers who had dismissed her, clients who had mocked her, colleagues who supported her, and strangers who had been moved by her story. The microphone was no longer in her hands, but her voice had already accomplished what she needed it to do. She had reminded a room full of people that every person they encountered had a story worth knowing, that circumstances could change anyone's situation in an instant, and that basic human kindness was a choice available to everyone regardless of their social or economic status. The revelation was complete, but Maya sensed that the real work was just beginning. The morning after the Hartwell Foundation Gala, Maya awoke to find her phone buzzing with notifications that seemed endless. Her story had gone viral overnight, shared across social media platforms by guests who had witnessed her speech, and amplified by strangers who connected with her experience of being dismissed based on appearance and circumstances. But the digital response was only the beginning. At 7:30 a.m., her doorbell rang, and James Morrison stood in her hallway, still wearing the formal suit from the previous evening, but looking as if he hadn't slept. "Maya," he said without preamble, "I owed you an apology and an explanation." She invited him in, offering the only chair in her small studio apartment while she perched on the edge of her bed. Morrison's presence seemed to fill the tiny space as he looked around at her sparse furnishings, the makeshift laboratory equipment on her kitchen table, the stack of research papers held down by a coffee mug, and the photograph of Rosa that held place of honor on her nightstand. "I knew you were overqualified for the position," Morrison said finally. "When you applied, your references were impeccable, but I could tell you were desperate for work. I made assumptions about why someone with your background would need a server job." Maya waited, sensing there was more. "I thought maybe you'd had problems with drugs or academic misconduct or personal issues that had derailed your career. It never occurred to me that you might be sacrificing your future to care for someone you loved. I should have asked. I should have tried to understand." The admission hung between them in the small room. Maya appreciated his honesty, but she was more interested in what came next than in relitigating the past. "The fellowship from NIH," Morrison continued. "It means you'll be leaving us." "Yes," Maya confirmed. "I submitted my 2 weeks' notice by email this morning." Morrison nodded. "I want to do something before you go. Last night, watching you speak, seeing the reaction from people who had dismissed you, it made me realize that my entire company could be doing things differently." Over the next hour, Morrison outlined a radical restructuring of his business model. He wanted to create a program that would identify employees with hidden talents and advanced education, providing them with flexible schedules that would allow them to pursue their primary careers while maintaining the income they needed for family emergencies. "Elena told me she has a nursing degree from El Salvador that isn't recognized here," Morrison explained. "Marcus in our prep kitchen has an engineering degree from Syria. Sarah on our cleaning crew was a high school principal before her husband's business failed. We have so much talent that we're wasting because we see uniforms instead of people." Maya felt a surge of excitement at the possibilities. You could create partnerships with local universities, allowing graduate students to work flexible schedules during family crises. You could develop internship programs that recognize people's professional expertise even when they're in transitional employment. "Exactly," Morrison said, "and I want you to help me design it. Not now. You have your fellowship to complete and your grandmother to care for. But someday, when you're Dr. Maya Chen with your own laboratory, I want you to consult on making the service industry more humane." The conversation planted a seed that would grow over the following months.
Maya realized that her experience had given her unique insight into the intersection of economic necessity and human dignity, knowledge that could be applied far beyond her own circumstances. Later that morning, Maya visited Rosa at the care facility, carrying the morning newspaper that featured her story on the front page of the local section. Rosa's eyes were brighter than they had been in months, and Maya could see recognition and pride in her grandmother's expression as she read selected passages aloud. "The neurologist thinks your speech therapy could be accelerated now," Maya told her grandmother softly. "The fellowship funding will allow us to try some experimental approaches that weren't covered before." Rosa's hand moved against Maya's, and Maya heard something that made her heart skip. A single, clear word. "Proud," Rosa whispered, her voice rusty from disuse but unmistakably intentional. Maya burst into tears, holding her grandmother's hand as the full emotional weight of the past months finally caught up with her. The sacrifice had been worth it. The humiliation and struggle had led to this moment of reconnection, this proof that love could survive even the most devastating circumstances. Dr. Mitchell arrived at the care facility an hour later, having tracked Maya down through the nursing staff. He found her in Rosa's room, surrounded by flowers that had been delivered throughout the morning from colleagues, former classmates, and strangers who had been moved by her story. "The NIH fellowship is just the beginning," Dr. Mitchell said, after greeting Rosa with the respectful formality she appreciated. "3 major research institutions have called this morning wanting to discuss collaboration. Your work on neural interfaces has caught the attention of people who can provide serious funding." But Maya had been thinking about more than just her research opportunities. "Dr. Mitchell, I want to establish a foundation that provides emergency funding for graduate students facing family medical crises. Too many brilliant minds are lost because people can't afford to choose between education and caring for their loved ones." Dr. Mitchell's eyes lit up with understanding. "The Chen Foundation for Academic Resilience?" "The Rosa Chen Foundation," Maya corrected. "Named for the woman who taught me that education is meaningless unless it serves something larger than yourself." Over the following weeks, the foundation idea gained momentum with astonishing speed. The viral nature of Maya's story had connected her with people across the country who had faced similar choices between academic advancement and family care. Stories poured in through social media and email. Brilliant students who had dropped out to care for sick parents, researchers who had abandoned promising careers when family businesses failed, innovators whose potential had been lost to circumstances beyond their control. Elena became Maya's first official partner in the foundation work, bringing her own experience with the challenges of balancing education and family responsibility. Together, they developed criteria for emergency grants that would allow students to maintain their academic progress while managing family crises. The Ashford family, meanwhile, had faced their own reckoning. The video of their treatment of Maya had been viewed millions of times, and the pharmaceutical company Harold headed had faced significant backlash from consumers and investors who were appalled by the family's behavior. 3 weeks after the gala, Vivian Ashford appeared at Morrison Catering, asking to speak with Maya privately. Morrison had arranged the meeting in his office, with Elena present as a witness and support. "I've come to apologize," Vivian said without preamble, her usual polished appearance slightly frayed around the edges. "And to make amends, if that's possible." Maya studied the woman who had spent months treating her as subhuman entertainment. "What kind of amends?" "Harold's company is committing $5 million to your foundation as a starting endowment," Vivian said. "It's not charity, it's recognition that we failed to see your value, and that failure cost us the opportunity to support important work." Maya was surprised by the magnitude of the offer, but she was more interested in the personal acknowledgement. "And your family?" Vivian's composure cracked slightly. "Chloe has taken down all the posts that featured you without permission. She's enrolled in a service learning program to understand the impact of social media on working people. Marcus and Blake are doing community service at senior care facilities to understand what you were going through with your grandmother." The efforts seemed genuine, though Maya suspected they were motivated as much by damage control as by genuine remorse. Still, the outcome would benefit people facing similar struggles, which mattered more than the motivation. "I accept your apology," Maya said carefully, "and I appreciate the Foundation's support, but I want to be clear that this doesn't erase what happened. It's a step toward making sure other people don't have to endure what I went through." The conversation marked a turning point in how Maya thought about her experience. She realized that the cruelty she endured wasn't ultimately about her. It was about systems and attitudes that dehumanize people based on their economic circumstances. Changing individual hearts was important, but changing systems was essential. Dr. Sarah Chem from Stanford became another unexpected ally, reaching out to collaborate on research and to fund expansion of the neural interface work. Her public apology had sparked conversations in academic circles about how researchers treated service workers at conferences and hospitals, leading to policy changes at several major institutions. 6 months after the gala, Maya was back in Dr. Mitchell's laboratory, but her perspective had been fundamentally altered by her time in service work. She approached her research with new urgency, driven by personal understanding of how neurological injuries affected families beyond just the patients themselves. The neural interface work progressed rapidly, partly because Maya now understood the patient experience from a caregiver's perspective. Her device designs incorporated feedback from families like her own, people who had navigated the healthcare system from positions of economic vulnerability. Rosa's recovery became a case study for Maya's research. The new speech therapy techniques, funded by the NIH Fellowship, helped Rosa regain significant communication ability. More importantly, Rosa became an active participant in Maya's research, helping to test prototypes and providing feedback on user interfaces. "You see differently now," Rosa told Maya during one of their research sessions, her words still halting but her meaning clear. "Before, you studied stroke. Now you understand it." The observation captured something essential about Maya's transformation. Her technical skills were always exceptional, but her empathy and understanding of real-world applications had deepened through personal experience. She was becoming not just a better researcher, but a more complete human being. Elena had enrolled in a nursing program, using flexible scheduling that Morrison's new employment model made possible. Her expertise in patient care, combined with Maya's technical innovations, led to collaborative projects that neither could have achieved alone. "We're not just colleagues anymore," Elena told Maya as they worked together on a prototype communication device. "We're family. That's what happens when you go through hard times together. You learn who will stand with you." The Morrison catering employment model that had emerged from Maya's story became a case study in progressive business practices. Other service companies began adopting similar approaches, recognizing that their workforce included vast reserves of talent that traditional employment structures were failing to utilize. By the end of Maya's first year back in graduate school, the Rosa Chen Foundation had provided emergency grants to over 200 students across the country. Each recipient had to commit to mentoring other students facing similar challenges, creating a network of mutual support that was becoming self-sustaining. The foundation's work had also influenced policy discussions at the federal level. Senator Pemberton, whose behavior at the fundraiser had been particularly egregious, had become an unexpected advocate for
legislation supporting graduate students with family medical emergencies. Maya suspected his support was politically motivated, but she welcomed any help in advancing the cause. Dr. Mitchell retired at the end of Maya's second year back in the program, but not before seeing her defend her dissertation successfully. The work on biocompatible neural interfaces had advanced beyond anything he had imagined when Maya first joined his laboratory as an undergraduate. "You've surpassed your teacher," Dr. Mitchell told Maya after her successful defense. "But more importantly, you've remembered that science serves humanity, not the other way around." Maya's graduation ceremony was attended by an unusual crowd. Rosa sat in the front row, her speech now clear enough to call out Maya's name during the processional. Elena and her children occupied several seats, along with dozens of Morrison Catering employees who had requested time off to attend. The Ashford family had sent flowers and a note of congratulation, though they didn't attend in person. But the most meaningful presence was the group of Rosa Chen Foundation recipients who had traveled from across the country to witness Maya's achievement. They represented dozens of fields: medicine, engineering, education, law, social work, and they understood what Maya's success meant for all of them. As Maya walked across the stage to receive her doctorate, she thought about the circuitous path that had brought her to this moment. The 18 months of service work, the humiliation and struggle, the constant choice between dignity and survival, all of it had shaped her into someone who could bridge the gap between academic excellence and human compassion. Dr. Maya Chen had finally emerged, not just as a brilliant researcher, but as someone who understood that true innovation came from seeing problems through the eyes of the people who lived with them every day. The foundation would continue to expand. The neural interface research would help millions of people recover from brain injuries, and the employment models pioneered at Morrison Catering would spread to other industries. But Maya knew that the most important change was personal. She had learned to see service as dignity, struggle as strength, and compassion as the highest form of intelligence. 5 years later, Dr. Maya Chen stood before the United Nations General Assembly, presenting her revolutionary neural interface technology that had restored communication to over 50,000 stroke survivors worldwide. Rosa, now 92, and using one of Maya's devices to assist her speech, sat in the gallery watching her granddaughter address world leaders about the intersection of technology and human dignity. The Rosa Chen Foundation had grown into an international organization, providing emergency support to students across 6 countries. Morrison Catering's employment model had been adopted by over 200 companies, creating flexible pathways for people balancing education with family responsibilities. Maya's research laboratory at MIT bore a simple plaque: "Every person has a story worth knowing." It served as a daily reminder to her team of graduate students, many of them foundation recipients, that innovation meant nothing without compassion. Elena had completed her nursing degree and now served as the foundation's Director of Family Services, helping other caregivers navigate the complex intersection of medical needs and financial realities. The 2 women remained close friends, their bond forged in the crucible of shared struggle and mutual support. The Belmont Grand Ballroom still hosted charity galas, but the evening that changed everything had left its mark. Service workers were now introduced by name at events, their expertise and backgrounds acknowledged alongside their professional service. It wasn't a perfect transformation, but it was a beginning. Maya kept her old Morrison Catering uniform in her office closet, not as a reminder of hardship, but as a symbol of resilience. She had learned that dignity wasn't something that could be taken away by circumstances. It was something that lived within, waiting for the right moment to speak its truth to power. Sometimes, the most profound revolutions begin with a single person refusing to remain invisible.